All right, let's jump right in. For as long as most of us can remember, the Canada-US relationship has felt, well, pretty rock solid, right? One of the most stable in the world. But what if that's not the case anymore? What if something has fundamentally shifted? Today, we're going to look at that exact idea through the eyes of someone who had a front row seat to all of it. And look, a statement like that carries some serious weight, especially when you consider who said it. This isn't just some random opinion from a talking head on TV. This is from Kristen Hillman. She was not only Canada's first female ambassador to the US, but also the longest serving one. And she said this right as she was packing up her office. So when she says the relationship has changed and isn't going back, you gotta listen. It's a pretty stark warning about a new reality.
Okay, so what's really changed? I mean, haven't we always had little squabbles over things like lumber or dairy? Well, what Ambassador Hillman is saying is that this is way deeper than that. This isn't about the usual political disagreements. We're talking about a crack in the very foundation of the relationship, how the two countries even think about each other.
Look, politics is always a little unpredictable, right? Hillman gets that. But what she's pointing out is what's different now. The big change is that those core ideas we always took for granted, collaboration, integration, the idea that we're stronger together, those are now being actively questioned. That basic assumption that has been the bedrock of the relationship for decades, the idea that working together is just better for everyone, well, that's just not a sure thing in American politics anymore.
So how do you explain such a huge abstract shift in a way that actually makes sense? Well, this is kind of brilliant. Hillman and her team used a surprisingly simple everyday analogy to get the point across. They used a hamburger. Yeah, a hamburger. Let me show you how it breaks down this whole complex issue. This is just a fantastic way to see the change. For years, the story Canadian diplomats told was the old story. The message was simple. We build things together. You've got wheat from Manitoba for the bun, beef from Texas, maybe some tomatoes from Ontario. It's all one big, super efficient cross-border team effort. That was the sales pitch. But now we have the new story. The U.S. perspective is shifting more towards America first. That deep integration, the whole hamburger model, it's not really the goal anymore. The focus is more on doing things on their own.
Okay, so if the old playbook is out the window, where does that leave Canada? I mean, that sounds kind of scary, right? Like a real crisis. But what's so interesting about Hillman's take is that she sees this tough new reality as something else. She calls it a necessary wake-up call.
And honestly, this might be the most surprising part of this whole thing. Instead of just doom and gloom, she actually sees an opportunity here. She's basically saying this forces Canada to, stop just assuming everything with its southern neighbor will always be smooth sailing, and to start focusing with real intensity on its own strengths and its own interests.
So what does that actually mean? Like, what do you do? Well, Hillman lays out some really concrete steps. We're talking about boosting trade between our own provinces, breaking down those internal barriers. It means investing in big nation-building infrastructure projects. And maybe most importantly, it means Canada has to become its own best customer. It's all about looking inward to build up our own strength and resilience.
Okay, so Canada focuses more on itself, but you can't just ignore the US, obviously. So how does the strategy for dealing with America have to change? Well, the big takeaway is that it's got to be about more than just dealing with the White House. Let's be real, Hillman is super clear on this point. At the end of the day, in the American system, there is one person who calls the shots on policy, and that's the president. The buck stops there. You just can't get around that fact. But, and this is a huge but, while the president is the final decider, influence is absolutely everywhere. So the advice she gives is to play the long game. You have to build this massive, deep web of relationships. Yeah, you talk to the administration, of course, but you also have to be talking to Congress, people on the Hill. You need relationships with state governors, with individual senators, with the CEOs of huge companies, even with those influential people who aren't in the headlines but are pulling the strings behind the scenes. And that's really the core of the new strategy right there. The big advice is get out of Washington. America is so much more than just Washington, D.C. You've got to understand the whole country, build relationships everywhere, because what happens in Texas or California or Michigan, that stuff matters, and it absolutely influences what happens in the Capitol. So after all the talk about politics and strategy and trade, Hillman's final thoughts really bring it back to a more human level. She talks about something more fundamental, which is just the connection between Canadians and Americans as people.
And get this, for a surprising stat, despite all the political tension you hear about on the news, in just her last 8 months on the job, Canada saw more high-level visits from U.S. senators, governors, and CEOs than in her entire previous time as ambassador. Think about that. It's pretty powerful proof that, away from the political noise, a lot of very important people in the U.S. are still deeply invested in keeping this relationship strong. And this is what she leaves us with, really, her final takeaway from traveling all over the United States. She said that everywhere she went, even when they didn't agree on every single thing, she found nothing but kindness and welcoming arms. And that's just a powerful reminder, isn't it? That underneath all the politics and the official stuff, there's this really strong human connection.
So, that kind of leaves us with a pretty big question to think about. If that top-down official relationship isn't the guaranteed thing it used to be, well, what does that mean? It means the foundation of the partnership relies more than ever on the rest of us, on the connections between our businesses, our towns, our communities, between everyday people. The bond becomes less about what governments decide and a whole lot more about us. So the real question to leave you with is, in this new reality, what part do we all play in keeping that bond strong?